Ever feel like you're navigating a familiar landscape, only to suddenly realize there are hidden valleys and unexpected peaks you never knew existed?
Happens all the time.
That's the kind of journey we love to take you on here at the Deep Dive. And today, well, we've got a fascinating and potentially eye-opening exploration planned just for you.
Sounds intriguing.
We're plunging into the arguments presented in Jesus, interrupted, revealing the hidden contradictions in the Bible and why we don't know about them, by the renowned New Testament scholar Bart D. Ehrman.
Ah, Ehrman. Yes, a big name in the field. So for this deep dive, tailored specifically to your curiosity, we're not just glancing at the cover.
Right.
Our mission is to extract the most significant insights from Ehrman's book regarding the contradictions he identifies within the Bible, focusing particularly on the New Testament.
And crucially,
Yeah, we'll also be looking at his explanations for why these aren't more widely discussed.
and just so everyone's clear, to ensure we're all on the same page, we've compiled a range of materials that summarize Ehrman's work. Think of these as our navigational charts for today.
Good analogy.
We'll be sticking closely to the information presented in the book as relayed through these sources. So with that in mind, let's dive right in.
Okay.
What would you say is the central point Ehrman is trying to make?
Okay, let's unpack his core argument. At its heart, Ehrman's central thesis is quite straightforward, really. The Bible, and especially the New Testament, isn't a uniformly consistent text. Perfectly handed down without variation.
It's not perfectly smooth.
Not at all. Instead, he contends that it contains numerous significant internal contradictions and discrepancies.
And these aren't just minor slips.
No, exactly. These are not minor, easily overlooked errors. He's talking about substantive disagreements on historical details and fundamental theological concepts, particularly those surrounding Jesus. So for you, the key takeaway is that this directly challenges that traditional notion of a flawlessly harmonious, divinely inerrant Bible.
Right, the idea that everything lines up perfectly.
Yeah.
So if these contradictions are as significant as Ehrman suggests, where does he propose they originate? What's the underlying cause?
Here's where it gets really interesting for your understanding. Ehrman argues that these contradictions are primary evidence that the Bible is, and this is his phrase, a completely human book.
A human book.
Meaning it's a product of many different human authors writing within their own specific historical and cultural contexts, over a considerable span of time.
Right, not dictated all at once.
Exactly. So rather than a single unified divine voice, what we have is a collection of documents from diverse individuals and communities. And each was shaped by their own perspectives, their beliefs, and importantly, their own theological agendas.
Different motivations.
Precisely. Ehrman emphasizes that the New Testament authors held, quote, diverging views about who Jesus was and how salvation works. Think of it like getting multiple eyewitness accounts of the same event. Each will have its own nuances, right? Details shaped by the observer's viewpoint.
That makes sense. Different writers, different perspectives. But if these contradictions are, so apparent to scholars, why, according to Ehrman, isn't this common knowledge for the general public? I mean, it seems like a pretty fundamental point.
Exactly. And this is a crucial part of his argument, and it directly impacts your understanding of the information you might have encountered about the Bible.
How so?
Ehrman posits that there's a significant disconnect, a gap, really, between the widespread recognition of these issues within academic biblical scholarship and the prevailing understanding among the general public.
The scholar versus public gap he talks about.
That's the one. He contends that critical scholars have long acknowledged these contradictions, the diversity of viewpoints, even evidence for things like pseudepigraphy. Simply put, it's the practice of writing under a false name, like attributing a letter to Paul when Paul didn't actually write it.
Got it.
And he says these aren't radical fringe theories within the academic community. Jesus, interrupted, is, in many ways, Ehrman's attempt to bridge this gap.
Bringing it to a wider audience.
Exactly. To bring these scholarly perspectives to a wider audience and explain, quote, why we don't know about them. He wants to shed light on why the average reader might not be aware of these internal tensions within the biblical text.
Okay. And how does Ehrman actually go about identifying these contradictions? What's his method for, uncovering them?
He heavily relies on the historical critical method.
Right, the standard academic approach.
Pretty much. It involves examining the biblical texts within their original historical, literary, and cultural contexts, trying to understand what the authors were intending to say to their original audience.
Makes sense.
And a crucial technique he emphasizes, important for you to grasp, this is what he calls horizontal reading.
Horizontal reading.
Yeah. It involves comparing parallel accounts of the same events or themes across different biblical books. So, for example, looking at how the story of Jesus healing the paralytic is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side.
Instead of just reading one book straight through.
Precisely. He contrasts this with vertical reading, where you just read one book start to finish. He argues that horizontal reading is vital for spotting the differences and the unique perspectives of each author, details that can often be smoothed over or just missed in a purely vertical approach.
Okay, so he's systematically comparing the same stories as told in different books. What's his stance on attempts to, reconcile these differences, harmonize them?
Harmonization. Yeah, Ehrman is very clear and quite firm on this point, and it's important for you to understand his perspective.
Okay.
He explicitly rejects harmonization. That's the practice of trying to reconcile differing biblical accounts into one single consistent narrative.
Well, I reject it.
Well, he argues that when you do that, you're essentially creating your own composite version of the story, one that isn't exactly what any of the original authors intended to convey.
You're making something new, basically.
Oh, you are. For Ehrman, the contradictions themselves are significant data. They offer us valuable insights into the perspectives of the different authors and the development of early Christian thought.
So don't explain them away.
Right. Instead of trying to explain them away or make them fit together neatly, he insists on allowing them to stand and examining what they reveal about the human element in the Bible's creation.
All right, let's get down to some specific examples then. Where does Ehrman see these contradictions manifesting most clearly within the New Testament?
Okay, good. He dedicates a significant portion of his book to detailing contradictions within the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
The core narrative.
Exactly. Let's start with the accounts surrounding Jesus' birth, the nativity stories. He highlights that Matthew and Luke present distinctly different narratives of these events.
Different in what key ways?
Well, for starters, the genealogies they provide for Jesus are completely different.
The family trees.
Yeah. They trace different lines of descent, have different starting points. Matthew goes back to Abraham, Luke goes all the way back to Adam, and even the number of generations listed varies considerably.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, both trace the lineage through Joseph, which, creates a theological question for some, given the concept of the virgin birth.
Right. If Joseph isn't the biological father.
Exactly. And for you, it's important to note that Ehrman also points out that Matthew seems to structure his genealogy very deliberately in sets of 14 generations.
14. Why?
Possibly as a symbolic link to the numerical value of King David's name in Hebrew, even if it means omitting some generations mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament.
So not just different ancestors, but a potentially symbolic structure at play in one account.
Mm-hmm.
What about the actual events described in the birth narratives, the story itself?
Yeah, we see even more divergence there. Matthew describes Joseph and Mary as seemingly already living in a house in Bethlehem. That's where they're visited by wise men, the Magi, right? Guided by a star.
The famous star.
Yes. And this is followed by a flight to Egypt to escape Herod's decree. Luke, on the other hand, tells a different story.
How so?
He says their hometown was Nazareth, and they only traveled to Bethlehem to register for a census ordered by Caesar Augustus. And there, Jesus was born in a manger and visited by local shepherds. No wise men, no flight to Egypt mentioned.
So different locations, different visitors, different reasons for being in Bethlehem.
Pretty much. And Ehrman questions the historical plausibility of Luke's supposed empire-wide census at that specific time. There isn't strong supporting evidence from other historical sources. He also raises questions about the rather extraordinary behavior of the star in Matthew's account.
The star guiding the Magi.
Yeah. He suggests that both Matthew and Luke were primarily aiming to fulfill the Old Testament prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, even though Jesus was widely known to have grown up in Nazareth.
So theology driving the narrative.
That's his argument. So for you, the key is that these different narratives seem driven by theological aims, perhaps as much as or even more than strict historical reporting.
Okay, so different stories serving a similar theological purpose. What about Jesus' actual ministry, his teachings, the miracles he performed? Are there contradictions evident there as well, according to Ehrman?
Oh, absolutely. Ehrman brings up several compelling examples that might surprise you.
Like what?
Okay, take the story of Jairus' daughter. Remember that one? Healing story.
Vaguely, yes.
In Mark's gospel, Jairus approaches Jesus while his daughter is still alive, but she's gravely ill. She tragically dies while Jesus is on his way to help.
Okay.
However, in Matthew's version of the same event, Jairus tells Jesus that his daughter has already died when he first comes to him seeking help.
Wow, that's a pretty significant difference in the sequence of events and, well, Jairus' initial plea.
It is indeed. Ehrman also points to seemingly contradictory sayings attributed to Jesus.
Like?
For instance, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Whoever is not with me is against me." Pretty stark division, right?
Yeah, clear line.
But in Mark's Gospel, we find Jesus saying, "Whoever is not against us is for us," which presents a much more inclusive perspective.
Huh. Opposite message, almost.
Ehrman raises the question for you. How can these two seemingly opposing statements be reconciled?
Good question.
Then there's the way John's Gospel presents the beginning of Jesus' ministry compared to the others. John explicitly calls the miracle at Cana, turning water into wine, the first sign.
Right, the very first one.
Yet, John also mentions that Jesus had already performed many signs in Jerusalem prior to this event, and later refers to another miracle as the second sign after Cana.
So that doesn't quite add up.
It creates a discrepancy in the timeline and the significance of the Cana miracle. And the timing of the cleansing of the temple, that's another major point of divergence.
Where he drives out the money changers.
That's the one. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, place this event in the last week of Jesus' life, close to his crucifixion.
Okay, end of his ministry.
But John's Gospel places it right at the very beginning of his public ministry, years earlier.
Wow, okay. So John seems to have a notably different chronological framework for some key events in Jesus' life. What other discrepancies does Ehrman highlight in this period?
Well, the prediction of Peter's denial also has interesting variations that Ehrman draws attention to.
Peter saying he doesn't know Jesus.
Exactly. Mark's Gospel records Jesus saying that Peter will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows twice. Very specific detail.
Twice.
In contrast, Matthew, Luke, and John all recount Jesus predicting that Peter will deny him 3 times before the rooster crows only once.
Once versus twice.
Even the disciples' understanding and questions in John's Gospel appear inconsistent if you compare different passages. At one point, they ask Jesus where he is going, indicating they don't know.
Right.
Later, Jesus states that none of them are asking him where he is going, suggesting they do understand, or at least aren't asking anymore.
A bit confusing.
It can seem that way. And then there's a rather peculiar detail in Matthew's account of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
Riding into the city.
Yes. Some interpretations suggest Jesus is riding on both a donkey and a colt simultaneously.
How would that even work?
Good question. Ehrman proposes that this might be Matthew's very literal attempt to fulfill a prophecy from the Old Testament book of Zechariah, which mentions both animals.
Trying to tick the prophecy box literally.
That's the idea. So for you, these details illustrate how different authors interpreted and presented the same event, sometimes leading to what look like, well, contradictions.
That's already a significant number of variations. What about the most crucial part of the narrative for Christian theology? The passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
Right. This is where Ehrman argues we find some of the most profound and theologically significant contradictions.
Okay, like what?
The timing of Jesus' Last Supper in relation to the Jewish Passover. That's a major point of contention.
How so?
The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, strongly imply that the Last Supper was indeed a Passover meal, which would place Jesus' crucifixion on the actual day of Passover.
Okay.
However, John's Gospel presents a different timeline. It suggests that the Last Supper occurred the day before Passover, and that Jesus was crucified when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple.
Well, that's a big difference.
Huge. And Ehrman suggests that John's version has a clear theological motive to portray Jesus himself as the ultimate Passover lamb, sacrificed for the sins of humanity.
So Jesus is the lamb being sacrificed at the right time in John's version.
That seems to be the theological point John is making. So for you, this represents a fundamental difference in how the events are placed within the Jewish religious calendar, and it carries significant theological weight.
That's a pretty fundamental difference with considerable theological implications, yeah. What about the details surrounding the crucifixion itself?
Even the time of the crucifixion differs between the gospel accounts. Mark's gospel states that Jesus was crucified at the 3rd hour.
Which is?
Around 9 a.m. However, John's gospel indicates that Jesus' trial before Pilate was still ongoing around the 6th hour, which is noon.
9 a.m. versus noon. That's quite a gap.
It is. The specific details of the Last Supper also vary. The synoptics focus on Jesus instituting the Eucharist, the sharing of bread and wine, right? Symbolic of his body and blood with the words, "This is my body, this is my blood."
The communion ritual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
John's Gospel completely omits this institution of the Eucharist. Instead, John recounts the story of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples.
Foot washing instead of communion. Interesting.
Very. Then there's the portrayal of Jesus' demeanor and his final words on the cross. This is striking.
How do they differ?
Mark depicts a Jesus in profound anguish, even crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
A moment of despair.
Yes. Luke, in contrast, portrays a calmer, more composed Jesus who offers forgiveness to his executioners and dies with a prayer of trust to God. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit."
Very different tone.
Completely. And John's portrayal is different yet again. Jesus appears more in control, focused on the well-being of others, like his mother, and finally declaring, "It is finished," like completing a task.
Wow. Anguish, trust, completion. 3 distinct portrayals.
Exactly. Ehrman argues these are not just minor variations in wording, but represent fundamentally different understandings of the significance and meaning of Jesus' death.
It sounds like each gospel author had their own particular way of framing these absolutely pivotal moments in the narrative.
Precisely. And the discrepancies don't end with Jesus himself. Even the events immediately surrounding his death show variations. Mark's gospel says that the curtain of the temple, symbolizing the separation between humanity and God, tore in two after Jesus died.
Okay.
Luke's account seems to place this event before Jesus' death. And interestingly, John's gospel doesn't mention the tearing of the temple curtain at all.
Before, after, or not at all. Then, the centurion's confession upon witnessing Jesus' death also differs. In Mark, the Roman centurion exclaims, "Truly this man was the Son of God."
A declaration of divinity.
Yes. Whereas in Luke, he says, "Certainly this man was innocent," or righteous, depending on the translation. A declaration of innocence, not divinity.
Different focus again.
And Pilate's role in the proceedings is also emphasized differently. John's gospel repeatedly stresses Pilate's declarations of Jesus' innocence and his reluctance to condemn him.
Making Pilate seem less guilty.
Perhaps, or emphasizing the injustice more. That point isn't as prominent in Mark's narrative. And then, of course, we arrive at the resurrection accounts.
Which, as many listeners might be aware, are frequently cited as having a number of variations between the different gospels. Indeed, they are. Ehrman meticulously points out the differing accounts of who were the first to visit Jesus' tomb, what they saw when they arrived. Like, the number of angelic figures present varies, sometimes 1, sometimes 2 men or angels, and the specific sequence of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection.
The order of events differs.
Yes. And there's even an apparent contradiction within the writings attributed to Luke himself. His gospel seems to suggest that the resurrection, Jesus' appearances to his disciples, and his ascension into heaven all occurred on the same day. One packed Sunday.
All in one day.
Seems that way in the Gospel of Luke. However, the book of Acts, which is also traditionally attributed to Luke, explicitly states that Jesus appeared to his followers over a period of 40 days before his ascension.
1 day versus 40 days. That's significant.
It is. So for you, these inconsistencies highlight the challenges in constructing a single, unified account of the resurrection events based solely on the Gospels and Acts.
Okay, so across the entire narrative, from his birth to his resurrection, Ehrman identifies these significant contradictions within the Gospels. But he also argues that there are differing theological perspectives at play between different New Testament authors, right? Not just narrative details.
Yes, absolutely. This is a crucial layer to his argument. He contends that there are significant theological disagreements and varying emphasis between different writers in the New Testament.
So disagreements about what it all means.
Exactly. A major example he explores is the contrast between the teachings of the Apostle Paul in his letters and the portrayal of Jesus and his teachings in the Gospels, particularly Matthew, as well as the Epistle of James.
Regarding what specifically?
Regarding concepts like justification, how one is made right with God, the role of the Jewish law, and the importance of good works.
Okay. Could you elaborate on that contrast for our understanding? That sounds pretty fundamental.
Certainly. It is fundamental. Ehrman argues that Matthew's gospel presents Jesus as upholding the validity of the Jewish law. Jesus says, right, that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Okay. Follow the law.
Ehrman suggests that Matthew's portrayal implies that salvation, or right standing with God, is linked, at least in part, to following the law, even as intensified by Jesus' ethical teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. Works matter.
Got it. What about Paul?
Paul, however, in his letters, strongly emphasizes the concept of justification by faith in Jesus Christ, completely apart from the works of the law.
Faith, not works.
That's Paul's emphasis. For Paul, attempting to earn God's favor through adherence to the rituals and commandments of the Jewish law is not only ineffective, but potentially even a hindrance to true faith.
Wow. That sounds like a direct disagreement.
Ehrman sees this as a fundamental disagreement on how one achieves a right relationship with God. He even draws a distinction between the actual message of Jesus as presented in the Gospels, which often focuses on the coming kingdom of God, and his interpretation of the law, and the message about Jesus that Paul preached.
What's the difference there?
The message about Jesus, for Paul, centers on the saving power of Jesus' death and resurrection. Ehrman points out that Paul actually quotes Jesus' direct teachings relatively infrequently in his letters. He's focusing more on his theological interpretation of Christ's significance, his death and resurrection, rather than Jesus' earthly sayings about the law or the kingdom.
That's a pretty stark theological contrast between these key figures in the New Testament. What about different understandings of who Jesus actually was, his divine nature, for example?
Yes. That brings us to the realm of Christology, which, in simple terms for you, is the study of the nature and identity of Christ. Who was Jesus?
Right.
Ehrman argues that the New Testament reveals a development, maybe an evolution, in how Jesus was understood by his followers and the early church.
It changed over time.
That's his argument. He suggests that Mark, generally considered the earliest of the Gospels, presents what scholars often refer to as lower Christology.
Lower meaning.
More human. In Mark, Jesus is portrayed as more human, experiencing a wide range of emotions, limitations, and possibly becoming the Son of God at a specific point in time, perhaps his baptism or the Transfiguration.
Okay, so not necessarily divine from eternity past in Mark.
That's a possible reading Ehrman discusses. John's Gospel, written later, presents a much higher Christology, much more divine.
How so?
John introduces Jesus as the pre-existent divine Logos, the Word that was with God from the very beginning. John explicitly states his divinity with powerful claims like, I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am.
Much more explicit claims to divinity.
Absolutely. Ehrman views this highly divine portrayal of Jesus in John as a later development within Christian theological thought. He raises the point, if Jesus had explicitly claimed to be God during his earthly ministry, as depicted in John, it seems unusual that the earlier Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, don't clearly record such explicit claims.
Why wouldn't they mention something so important?
That's the question Ehrman poses. So for you, this suggests that the understanding of Jesus' divine nature wasn't static, but developed over time within the early Christian movement.
So a progression in how Jesus' divine nature was conceived and articulated by early Christian writers.
That's Ehrman's contention, yes. Let's do differing soteriologies.
Soteriologies.
Simply put, different understandings of salvation and how it is achieved through Christ. How does salvation work?
Okay, got it.
He notes that both Mark and Paul heavily emphasize Jesus' death as a sacrificial act that atones for the sins of humanity, reconciling humanity with God. Substitutionary atonement.
Jesus dying for our sin.
Right. However, he suggests that Luke's gospel might have a slightly different emphasis. It doesn't seem to foreground the specific idea of substitutionary atonement in quite the same explicit way as Mark or Paul.
So Luke might see salvation slightly differently.
Potentially a different emphasis, yeah.
Yeah.
Again, these differing perspectives contribute to Ehrman's overarching argument that the New Testament authors had their own distinct theological viewpoints and priorities. They weren't all saying exactly the same thing in exactly the same way.
It seems that these contradictions and differing theological viewpoints weren't limited to just the figure of Jesus himself, according to Ehrman's analysis.
That's correct. He also examines contradictory portrayals of other significant figures and events within the New Testament.
Like who else?
A key example he discusses is the Apostle Paul's dramatic conversion experience on the road to Damascus, the blinding light story.
Yeah, very famous.
Ehrman points out that the book of Acts actually describes this pivotal event 3 separate times. And each account contains slightly different details regarding who saw what and who heard what. Did the companions see the light? Did they hear the voice? It varies.
Huh. Different versions in the same book.
Yes. He also highlights apparent contradictions between the book of Acts account of Paul's life and Paul's own letters, particularly the letter to the Galatians.
Contradictions between Acts and Paul himself.
Concerning Paul's early activities and travels after his conversion, like when exactly did he first go to Jerusalem? Who among the apostles did he interact with? How well known was he in Judea? Acts and Galatians seem to give different timelines and details on these points.
So even the historical accounts of key figures like Paul, a central figure in early Christianity, seem to exhibit inconsistencies, according to Ehrman.
Exactly. And to further illustrate that this phenomenon isn't solely confined to the New Testament, Ehrman also briefly touches upon some analogous examples from the Old Testament as well.
Oh, contradictions there too.
He points to examples like the differing creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2.
Right, the order of creation is different.
Yes, light before the sun in one, man before plants and animals in the other, different names for God used. Also, the specific instructions given to Noah regarding the number of animals to bring onto the ark, is it 2 of every kind, or 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean?
I remember that one.
There are also numerical discrepancies found in books like Ezra regarding temple vessels, conflicting names given for certain individuals like David's scribe or Huldah's husband in different historical books, and even differing theological views on complex topics like the nature of suffering or the possibility of divine forgiveness within the Old Testament itself.
So it's a broader pattern he's identifying.
These examples serve to show that the presence of differing perspectives and apparent contradictions is a broader characteristic of the biblical texts as a whole, in Ehrman's view, not just a New Testament issue.
Okay, so Ehrman has laid out all these various contradictions and differing viewpoints he finds within the Bible, Old and New Testaments. What is his explanation for why these inconsistencies exist in the first place? What are the underlying historical and textual reasons he proposes?
Right. He points to several interconnected key factors. The first, and perhaps most fundamental, is simply the reality of multiple human authorship.
We touched on that earlier. Many writers.
Exactly. As we've discussed, the Bible isn't a single book written by one individual. It's a collection of diverse books written by many different people over a significant period, each coming from their own unique historical, cultural, and theological backgrounds, with their own intended audiences and purposes. That alone invites diversity, right?
Sure.
Secondly, he emphasizes the long period of oral tradition, particularly in the case of the Gospels. The stories and sayings of Jesus were primarily passed down by word of mouth for several decades before they were eventually written down.
Like a game of telephone over years.
Well, maybe not quite that random, but during this time of oral transmission, it's natural for stories to evolve, be adapted, maybe embellished as they were retold in different communities and contexts. Things change in the telling.
Okay.
Ehrman also brings up the significant issue of pseudepigraphy, which, as we touched on earlier, is writing under a false name.
Right. Writing as Paul when you're not Paul.
Exactly. He argues that many books in the New Testament, including the Gospels themselves, which were originally anonymous, and a number of the letters attributed to Paul, were likely not written by the individuals whose names they bear, but by later followers or admirers writing in their name or tradition.
That's a rather significant claim regarding the authorship of these foundational texts. How does that contribute to contradictions?
Well, it plays a crucial role in his explanation. If different authors, writing perhaps decades later and with their own theological interpretations or agendas, are responsible for these texts, then variations and even contradictions are much more likely to arise than if it were all directly from the named apostles, for instance.
Different people, different times, different views.
Makes sense, right? Ehrman also stresses the factor of theological adaptation. He suggests that the authors of the biblical books often deliberately shaped or altered certain details in their narratives to better fit their own theological agendas and the specific needs of their intended audiences.
Like the timing of the crucifixion in John.
That's the prime example he uses. We saw potential examples of this in the differing birth narratives and the varying accounts of the timing of Jesus' death relative to Passover. Theology drives the details sometimes.
Okay. Any other reasons?
Finally, he discusses the use of sources. The gospel writers, for instance, likely drew upon various oral traditions and possibly even earlier written sources, like the hypothetical Q source for Matthew and Luke in compiling their accounts.
Tying pieces together.
Right. And inconsistencies could easily arise when they attempted to combine or edit these different source materials, especially if the sources themselves contained conflicting information. He even mentions the concept of editorial fatigue.
Editorial fatigue.
Yeah, where an author in the process of compiling and editing huge amounts of material might inadvertently retain a detail from one source that contradicts a change they have made elsewhere in the text. just sort of missing it in the editing process.
So it's a complex interplay of human factors. Multiple authors, oral transmission, maybe some pseudepigraphy, theological shaping, source combination issues, all contributing to these internal contradictions.
That's a good summary of his explanation, yes.
Now let's turn our attention to the second part of the book's intriguing title, and why we don't know about them. What's Ehrman's perspective on this lack of widespread awareness? Why isn't this common knowledge?
Okay. He proposes several interconnected reasons for this phenomenon. The most fundamental, perhaps, is that existing disconnect we mentioned earlier between the world of academic biblical scholarship and the understanding of the general public.
The gap again.
Right. While scholars have often recognized and analyzed these issues for decades, this information hasn't always been effectively communicated or made readily accessible to people outside of university settings and theological seminaries. It stays in the ivory tower, so to speak.
Okay, what else?
He also points to the role played by pastors, religious leaders, and perhaps seminaries themselves.
How so?
He suggests that while many within these institutions may be aware of the findings of critical biblical scholarship, there might be a hesitancy to openly share or emphasize potentially faith-challenging information with their congregations or students.
Only hesitant?
Perhaps out of a concern for undermining deeply held beliefs or maybe causing unnecessary controversy or confusion. It's sensitive stuff.
That does seem like a delicate balance to navigate for religious leaders.
Yeah.
What other factors does Ehrman suggest contribute to this lack of public awareness?
He discusses common reading practices, how people actually read the Bible. Many people approach it with an expectation of perfect consistency and harmony between different passages.
They assume it all fits together.
Exactly. And this leads to a natural tendency to try and smooth over any apparent discrepancies, to create a unified and seamless narrative in their own minds. This practice of harmonization effectively masks the underlying contradictions. You read through them looking for harmony.
Instead of seeing the differences.
Right. Furthermore, the common practice of reading individual books of the Bible vertically, focusing on one book at a time, start to finish, rather than comparing parallel passages horizontally across different books, also contributes to overlooking these variations. You miss the contrasts if you don't compare.
Makes sense.
Then there's the very significant influence of the doctrine of biblical inerrancy.
The belief the Bible has no errors at all.
Exactly. The theological belief that the Bible, in its original manuscripts, is completely without error of any kind, historical, scientific, theological, whatever. For individuals and communities who hold this view, there's a strong pre-commitment, a presupposition, to explaining away any apparent contradictions through various interpretive methods, rather than acknowledging their existence as actual contradictions.
So the belief itself prevents seeing the contradictions.
It can lead people to rationalize them away, yes. Finally, Ehrman argues that many modern readers lack the necessary historical and cultural context to fully understand these ancient texts. They might inadvertently impose modern expectations about factual consistency, about literary conventions onto writings that were produced in a very different time and served different purposes. Ancient history isn't like modern journalism.
So it's a combination of factors. How scholars communicate, what religious leaders emphasize, how people read, theological beliefs like inerrancy, and a lack of historical context, all contributing to this general lack of awareness about the contradictions Ehrman identifies.
That sums up his perspective pretty well, yes. It's multifaceted.
Finally, could you give us a sense of how Ehrman structures his argument within the book, Jesus Interrupted Itself? How does he lay it all out?
Yeah, the book appears to follow a quite logical and accessible structure, aiming for a general audience, not just scholars. He often begins by sharing aspects of his own personal intellectual journey.
His own story.
Right. Tracing his own shift in perspective from a belief in biblical inerrancy, which he once held strongly, to his current scholarly understanding. This personal narrative helps to frame the issues and introduce the reader to the historical, critical approach he employs. Makes it relatable.
Okay, starts personal. Then what?
Following this, he delves into the evidence itself. He dedicates specific chapters to detailed examples of contradictions and discrepancies, particularly within the gospel narratives, really utilizing that method of horizontal comparison we discussed. Lots of examples.
Laying out the data.
Exactly. He then moves on to explore the underlying historical and textual reasons that likely account for these contradictions, covering topics like the multiple authorship, the role of oral tradition, pseudepigraphy, theological adaptation, use of sources, all the things we talked about.
Explaining the why.
Right. The book likely also addresses the historical process through which the New Testament canon, the collection of books considered authoritative or scriptural was formed, how did we get these books?
That's important context, too.
Definitely. And Ehrman's work seems to conclude with reflections on how these findings might impact personal faith and understanding. He's not necessarily trying to destroy faith, but suggests a more nuanced and historically informed way of engaging with the biblical texts might be necessary or even helpful for some.
So, offering a different way forward.
Potentially, yeah. Overall, the structure of the book appears designed to be clear, engaging, and accessible for a general audience, presenting what can be complex scholarly ideas in a readable and understandable manner.
So, to bring everything together, what would you say is the most crucial takeaway message from Bart Ehrman's Jesus, interrupted for someone who's, never encountered these ideas before? The bottom line.
In essence, I think the core takeaway from Ehrman's work is his central argument that the Bible, and especially the New Testament, contains a significant number of internal contradictions and discrepancies. Full stop.
They're there.
They're there, he argues. And he attributes these not to some kind of divine error, but to the very human process through which these texts were written, compiled, and transmitted over time.
The human element again.
Yes, involving multiple authors with their own distinct perspectives, their own theological agendas, living in specific historical contexts. Furthermore, a key part of his message is that these findings, while pretty well established within academic biblical scholarship, are often not widely known or discussed by the general public.
Because of
that variety of factors we've explored. The communication gap between academia and the public, ingrained reading habits like harmonization, the influence of theological doctrines like inerrancy, and so on.
So it's about understanding the Bible not necessarily as a single, monolithic, perfectly consistent divine voice.
Right.
But rather as a complex collection of human perspectives on faith, shaped and expressed within specific historical and cultural contexts, and sometimes differing, even significantly, in their accounts and interpretations.
Precisely. That captures it well. It encourages a different lens through which to view these ancient texts, one that takes into account their inherent human element and the historical and literary complexities involved in their creation.
This has certainly provided a wealth of fascinating and definitely thought-provoking information for us to consider.
It's a lot to chew on.
It is. So for you, our listener, maybe consider this. If the Bible is understood not as a single inerrant divine voice, but as a collection of human perspectives on faith, shaped by their own unique context and sometimes differing significantly from one another, how might that fundamentally shift your approach to its teachings and their relevance in your life today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It's a significant question, yeah, and one that Ehrman's work compellingly invites us to explore. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into some challenging and potentially transformative ideas.